Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight in person and so many, and by Zoom. My name is Wilfried Seisler. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator here at Hillwood. And first, I would like to share with you, and tell you that Kate Marquette, our Executive Director, sends her regrets that she cannot be with us tonight. We are very, very pleased to have different audiences joining us tonight, not only in the theater, but also by Zoom. For those of you in the theater, I'm sure you all know what I will be asking you to do. I'm just showing one object, so please silence your phone. And for those of you at home, of course, we want to hear from you, and you may submit questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom menu. And when they cross your mind, you can do that anytime, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program, as well as from the theater. And of course, on Zoom, you can keep your phone on; it's all fine. Tonight's lecture is the first of our lecture series highlighting our special exhibition, Setting Sail: The Story of Sea Cloud. Next Thursday, we will hear from Dr. Kimberly Gant from the Brooklyn Museum, who will discuss Jacob Lawrence's work after his time on board Sea Cloud. To end the series, Thomas Wu, curator of the Sea Cloud exhibition, will take us on a tour of the ship in his presentation on March 27. There are still tickets available, so if you have not done yet, please buy immediately tickets, reserve your space. There are many ways to do so, so please do. Tonight, we are very excited to hear from Master Chief Petty Officer Vince Patton, who will explore Sea Cloud's role in Coast Guard history and the story of Captain Carlton Skinner, who played a significant role on board the Sea Cloud and commanded the yacht during World War II. We will also hear an introduction to the story of Sea Cloud. So tonight we have a lecture and a little introduction before it from Ken Sayers, the authors of Tales of the Sea Cloud, through a pre-recorded video. Actually, copies of the book are available for purchase in the shop upstairs following the lecture. And actually, Vince wrote the foreword for this book, so he will be more than happy to sign copies at the end of the presentation. A native of Detroit, Master Chief Vince Patton enlisted in the U.S. Coast Guard in 1972 and retired in 2002. During Master Chief Patton's Coast Guard career, he served on 3 cutters along with operational, training, and administrative assignments, including a joint service tour as a senior enlisted advisor to Joint Task Force 160 during Operation Support Democracy, and command senior enlisted leadership positions. The pinnacle of his military career was becoming the highest-ranking enlisted member of the service as the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard from 1998 to 2002. His numerous military awards include the Coast Guard Distinguished Service Medal, which is the highest peacetime recognition for performance of duty. Currently, he is president of Northeast Maritime Institute Foundation and is also an adjunct faculty member at Northeast Maritime Institute College of Maritime Science. He is actively involved with several other public service and non-profit organizations, serving on boards with the National Coast Guard's Museum, U.S. Naval Sea Cadet Corps, and the Uniformed Services Benefit Association. Before I hand the podium over to Vince, we will hear a short introduction from Ken Sayers. Don't forget. Thank you so much and enjoy the lectures.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to have this wonderful opportunity to share with you some information about Marjorie Post's magnificent yacht, Sea Cloud. I wish I could be with you in person today, but thanks to the magic of Zoom, I can at least be with you virtually. Let me begin with a brief background history of the ship. That will give you a broad context for what Vince will be discussing in a few minutes. In 1926, Edward F. Hutton, the second husband of Marjorie Merriweather Post, orders a new sailing yacht. He calls it Hussar, the 5th vessel of that name that he has owned. Hussar 5 is built by a shipyard in Germany and launched in April 1931. Between 1932 and 1935, the yacht carries the Huttons and their friends on cruises in Long Island Sound, the Caribbean Sea, and Pacific Ocean. Edward Hutton and Marjorie are divorced in September 1935, and title to Hussar passes to Marjorie. She renames the yacht Sea Cloud and later marries Joseph Davis in 3 months after the divorce. Davis serves as the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1937 and 1938, and he and Marjorie used Sea Cloud in Leningrad as an adjunct to the ambassador's residence in Moscow. On December 15, 1941, Davis leases Sea Cloud to the U.S. government for conversion to a Coast Guard weather ship. During the conversion, 3 of her mast and bowsprit are removed, and she is equipped with 2 3-inch guns and other weapons. The ship is commissioned on April 4th, 1942, as a Coast Guard cutter and designated as WPG-284. During the war, Sea Cloud and her crew performed weather patrols to collect key meteorological data in the North Atlantic. On April 9, 1943, the ship is transferred to the Navy and is commissioned as USS Sea Cloud and designated as IX-99. On November 18, 1943, Coast Guard Lieutenant Carlton Skinner reports on board Sea Cloud as executive officer. That's the number 2 officer. He assumes command of the ship on January the 28th, 1944. Under his command, Sea Cloud serves as a test bed to demonstrate the efficiency and effectiveness of a fully racially integrated ship. This is an experiment that Skinner proposed to the head of the Coast Guard in July 1943, and which he is now able to implement. In doing so, Skinner shows the Navy why and how to end racial segregation in the fleet. You'll be hearing much more about this shortly from Vince. On November the 4th, 1944, in a ceremony at the Boston Navy Yard, Sea Cloud is decommissioned and returned to her civilian owners. The yacht is sold in August 1955 to George W. Gibbs, and he in turn sells it to Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, who renames her as Angelita. Trujillo's son, Ramphis, uses the presidential yacht of the Dominican Republic as a party boat. Following Trujillo's assassination in May 1961, Angelita is renamed Patria and is offered for sale by the Dominican government in the spring of 1962. Clifford Barber Jr. of Operation Sea Cruise purchased the ship in 1967 and renames her Antarna. Antarna makes one luxury cruise before she is impounded by U.S. Customs Service in Miami in 1968 for non-payment of import duties. Stephanie and Charles Gallagher chartered Antarna in 1971 for use as a floating high school. Following several incidents and disputes between Operation Sea Cruise and the Gallaghers, Antarna is seized by Clifford Barber in Panama in March 1972. The yacht then sits disused and in a very deteriorating condition off Cologne, that's near the Panama Canal, for the next 6 years. In 1978, Hartmut Paschberg and a group of German investors purchased Antarna from Barber. The ship reacquires her formal name, Sea Cloud. In 1979, Sea Cloud undergoes a major overhaul and rebuilding in the very same shipyard in Germany where she had been constructed in 1930-1931. In 1994, Hermann Ebel and others acquire ownership of the vessel to be operated by Sea Cloud Cruises GmbH. To this day, Sea Cloud continues in her role as a luxury cruise vessel, flying the flag of Malta The legendary Windjammer sails in European waters during the summer season and in the Caribbean in the winter. By the way, if you'd like to experience life aboard Sea Cloud, as did Marjorie Post, you too can take a one-week cruise on the yacht for about $6,000. But better hurry, because the ship will be removed from service in October for an extensive rebuild. You know, I first became aware of Sea Cloud in 2010 when I was researching for my book, Uncommon Warriors, which was published by the U.S. Naval Institute. Sea Cloud was one of roughly 350 unclassified miscellaneous vessels designated in the IX series that I wrote about. The more I learned about Sea Cloud and Carlton Skinner's extraordinary leadership in the racial integration of the Navy, the more I wanted to share what I had learned with as many people as possible. And so I was thrilled to be able to work with Texas A&M University Press to publish such a book in 2021. As I wrote then, Carlton Skinner was either an idealistic pragmatist or a pragmatic idealist. Either way, what he accomplished on Sea Cloud in 1944 helped lead the way to eliminating racial segregation in the fleet. And in doing so, he was a barrier buster, a trailblazer, and an American hero. He certainly was a hero to me. I'll close now by expressing to you my sincere appreciation for your interest in Sea Cloud's backstory. I hope that my remarks and the discussion to follow will, like the book, increase awareness and understanding of that vessel's rich and colorful history, especially as it pertains to the racial integration of the sea services. To all of you, thank you very much.
Well, good evening. Hello. It's really wonderful to be here this evening and to, I got a standing room only crowd here, goodness. If you think I'm gonna give something away, you know, you got another thing coming. Well, my thanks to author Ken Sayers, and I know he is watching on Zoom as well, and he's probably not just watching, he's taking notes to make sure I do it right. But when Ken asked me to be a part of his project of doing this book, you know, it was an excitement in itself for me because the story of the Sea Cloud, for me, is over 50 years old. And that's from within my first year at the Coast Guard, learning about the Sea Cloud. And I wrote it in the foreword of Ken's book. And I've been fascinated ever since. I've had opportunities to meet crew members of the Sea Cloud, including Jacob Lawrence, as well as Carlton Skinner, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But before I get started, let's clear up a few things because there might be a little confusion. Coast Guard, and then you hear Navy, all right? Okay, what's going on here? Okay, well, the United States Coast Guard, founded in 1790 by the guy who was on the $10 bill. Who's the guy that's on the $10 bill? Hamilton, right, exactly. So every time I get a $10 bill, I always say, thank you, Father. And the creation of it at the time was called the Revenue Marine Cutter Service, and it was created because at that time, in around 1790, the U.S. Navy was disbanded, simply because the government just didn't have the kind of money to keep a Navy, particularly with problems that we were having with piracy, and more importantly, collection of taxes. So Hamilton, in his infinite wisdom, he had gone to Congress at least 2-3 times to try to get the Navy resurrected. It didn't work. Well, he's Secretary of Treasury, right? So he knows how to find money. So since Congress wouldn't give him the okay to bring the Navy back, he squandered away a little money in the U.S. Treasury, and he created his own Navy. And it was then called the Revenue Marine Cutter Service at the time, and the name was later shortened to Revenue Cutter Service. In 1914, the name became the United States Coast Guard because in addition to the missions that the Revenue Cutter Service was doing, both in terms of collection of taxes, but also creation of life-saving, running the lighthouses, a whole assortment of things. And in 1914, the name United States Coast Guard came about. However, the Coast Guard's birth date still remains August 4th in 1790. So I thought I'd give you that little info to also tell you, okay, now you know that part. Let's tell you about, well, what Coast Guard, Sea Cloud, Navy, Sea Cloud. Well, okay, what happened? Well, the Revenue Cutter Service / U.S. Coast Guard has served in every major war since its creation in 1790. In 1914, when the name Coast Guard was brought together, along with it came Title 14 U.S. Code Section 1, which clearly stated that the Coast Guard is always a military service. However, in time of war or when so ordered by the President, the Coast Guard becomes an entity of the Department of the Navy. So thus is why you see Navy, Coast Guard, and so forth. So during World War II, many of the Coast Guard vessels had a redesignation of name of USS and sometime in parentheses was CG. So that way it kind of signified that it's a Coast Guard operated vessel, but the USS, which is Navy designation, was used simply because of the fact that the Coast Guard was under the Navy at the time. So that kind of clears up. I'm sure I saw a few people scratching their head about that. So they were still Coast Guard, but because the service itself fell under the Department of the Navy. So that's what you have there. Okay, so as I get started on going through a few things, I got to tell you this. I told you about 50 plus years of my involvement and love for this ship for a lot of reasons. And one is, let's look at it from the most obvious perspective of being a young black American that came in the Coast Guard in 1972. First of all, my service at that particular time, there weren't very many of us. And then there was probably various reasons of that. We can talk about that at another time. But most importantly, I didn't see a lot of people like me. When I completed radioman school, which is after I went to boot camp in Cape May, New Jersey, and I went off to radioman school in Petaluma, California, I reported to my first ship, which was the Coast Guard cutter Dallas, which is home ported out of Governor's Island, New York. And just as I was getting off the ferry, because you had to take a ferry to get to Governor's Island, it's right at the tip of Manhattan. Now, how many of you know where oh, there's a few of you know where Governor's Island is. The only way to get there, you got to take a ferry. I get off the ferry, I got my sea bag and my other bag, and I'm struggling, and then along comes a gentleman who pretty much puts his arm around me and says, "Where you going, sailor?" And I says, "I'm trying to get to the Dallas." And he says, "Well, let me help you." Well, this gentleman, first when I looked at him, to my surprise, he was a black chief petty officer. This is the first time I ever seen a black chief petty officer in the Coast Guard. Now, of course, I had only been in the Coast Guard just a mere 7.5, 8 months at that time, but it was the first time that I saw him. So I was already amazed. Anyway, he helped me to the ship. We chatted a little bit. He told me his name. He said his name is Harold Wise, but everybody calls me Sonny Wise. And you can call me Chief. But he talked to me, and we chatted, and I had to ask him the obvious question, "Chief, you're the first black chief petty officer I've met." And he says, "Well, there's very few of us. But this is something you need to know even more than that. Let me tell you about the history of us in the Coast Guard." And he talked about the various things that went on in the Coast Guard. He talked about the Pea Island Life Saving Station. I'll talk a little bit about that. He talked a little bit about blacks throughout the Coast Guard, things what they did. And then he says, and then there's this ship. There was a ship that I hope you get to meet people that served on it. And it's called the Sea Cloud. And when he told me the story of the Sea Cloud, oh, was I ever amazed about that. And then my own little digging, I started finding people because, we're talking 1972, so there was still a sizable number of crew members that were still about. And I got a chance to meet many of them, talk with them and so forth, and I just learned this amazing story of the Sea Cloud. The crime out of all this is that this is a true American history story. And I think it's so important that you need to know that, because racial segregation existed in the armed forces prior to 1948. Now, wait a minute. When Ken gave his intro and he talked about the Sea Cloud becoming integrated in 1943, okay, let's do the math here. Racial segregation was going on until 1948. But as you see in this particular slide, that it was actually a law that the armed forces of the United States were to be segregated. And that's what makes this pretty unique in itself. In addition to that, over the course of time in the other services as well, that they had segregated units, et cetera, and so forth. But for the Coast Guard kind of inched a little bit in doing things differently, mostly because we're a small service of sort. The picture that you see up here, the 1928 photo of the only known all-colored surf station crew member of the United States Coast Guard, was located in Pea Island, North Carolina, which is on the Outer Banks. And this particular unit sort of moved away from every black or colored that served during that period of time, or to be stewards, which are merely just servants. That this particular station started doing things differently. It had an officer in charge, a chief petty officer, who was a bosun mate. And even when you date back before, when it was named as the Coast Guard under the life-saving service, the station keeper was also black as well. So there was just a long line of history. And I remember when Sonny Wise was telling me this story and telling me that there were people before me that laid a lot of struggle, but they came about and did well. And Pea Island is a story in itself that I would love to tell you even more. And my dear friend Joan Collins is here, who her father sort of closed out the legacy of Pea Island as the last station keeper at Pea Island in the late 1940s. And that particular station, although it is gone, mostly as a result of beach erosion and so forth, the remnants of that particular station sits in Manteo, North Carolina. And a little free plug for you that, and I think this is something important, that if you go down Outer Banks, please take a trip down to Manteo, North Carolina, and go visit the Pea Island station. And I think it's amazing, and either her husband or other family members that are there, who all, for the most part, have been descendants of the Pea Island. So I think it's worthwhile. But anyway, getting back to the story is the fact that, for the most part, all of the other blacks that served in the Coast Guard over that particular period of time were in the steward's branch, or servants. Made the beds, shined the shoes for the officers, served food. They weren't cooks. They were just servants. But some things happened. And it was because of this guy right here. Now, Carlton Skinner will forever be my hero for a lot of reasons. I had to chuckle a little bit as Ken was telling the story a little bit about Carlton Skinner, and said, well, what kind of guy is this guy? Well, I'll tell you about it. And I had the pleasure of sitting down talking with him just a few years before he died. And as the segregation policy was going about, Skinner was an executive officer on another Coast Guard cutter, the Northland. It was doing North Atlantic patrols, and somewhere at the beginning of World War II, and if you remember from your history, what was going on in the North Atlantic, a lot of German German U-boats that were pretty much attacking the convoys and so forth. Well, the Northland's job at that particular time was escorting convoys and also doing weather reports as well. The Northland had an engineering casualty, meaning that it just didn't work. Sitting out in the middle of the Atlantic, right in what they call Tornado Alley, the engineers worked hard overnight trying to figure out what was wrong. The problem had to do with both the boiler connections to the diesels. I'm not an engineer to tell you what all that meant, but that's the key part to that. While sitting in the wardroom of the Northland, then Lieutenant Skinner, talking with the engineering officer, and they've got the charts all laid out and the blueprints of the Northland, trying to trace the problem and so forth. The black steward who was serving the coffee looked at the drawings, said to both the engineering officer and to Lieutenant Skinner, "I think I know what the problem is." And of course, they both looked at him, "You're a steward." And he said, "Before I came in the Coast Guard, I worked at this gas station, and I also did some work at plants, particularly engine plants and so forth. I think I know what the problem is because they reminded me of this particular situation." So, Lieutenant Skinner listened to him, told the engineering officer, "Let that young man go down in the engine room and see if he can figure it out." And Skinner, first of all, did it as a challenge because he just said, well, if this guy opened up and was just so sure of himself that he can do this, I'm going to let him do it. Guess what? That young man went down there and made it work. Got the Northland out of Tornado Alley and went on about its business. Skinner never forgot that, and there'll be more of the story as I go on further about that. But it was the first part of the story of Skinner now realizing something's very wrong here. I've got a steward who is more qualified in most cases than my own engineering officer. But the Coast Guard, or the government overall, can only say he can serve coffee and shine my shoes and make my bed. And this is what bothered Skinner along the way. Well, you see that drafted proposal to the Commandant of the Coast Guard about a test? Well, let me tell you the rest of the story here. And I got this from Carlton Skinner himself, and it did not come out anywhere within the historical discussions overall, because they used the term that when the sea cloud was integrated, it was a test. There was no test, and here's what I mean by that. Skinner left the Northland and was sent to Coast Guard headquarters. It was meant as a punishment because, and during that era of World War II, and all of a sudden you're taking somebody out of a combat type of job and put them behind a desk, that it was meant as a punishment because Skinner's commanding officer on the Northland was violently upset with him for having that steward go down in the engine room and do the job. So Skinner said, "I'll get even." Skinner goes to headquarters where he's near the Commandant of the Coast Guard, the guy with 4 stars. Skinner goes up to him and starts telling him this story. And Admiral Washi, who was a Commandant of the Coast Guard, kind of, yeah, okay. Skinner then drafts this regulation of having people in the Coast Guard who have exceptional skills regardless of race be assigned to where they have to go. And then he used the P Island as one of those examples because he said, for example, look down there at P Island, which is an all-black station, or he used the term as all-colored station, but you had motor machinist mates, you had bosun mates, you had all kinds of different skill sets of people down there doing the job that's necessary. We can do this to the rest of the Coast Guard. Everybody thought he was nuts. Well, right about that time, as luck would have it, is when the Lend-Lease program that the Navy / Coast Guard was involved with of borrowing civilian vessels for use. Skinner, he's going to get out of headquarters. So, because he just happened to be involved in that project of identifying ships to be able to be used in the Lend-Lease program. So Skinner buddied up to his boss and said, I want one of those. And his boss says, fine. And then Skinner says, well, can I pick my own crew? And the boss says, fine. But he said, we are really, really having a tough time putting the kind of people we need on there. Skinner said, no problem. I could take care of that. Skinner goes to Manhattan Beach, New York, which is where Coast Guard boot camp was at the time, and primarily were all of the blacks that went to boot camp in Manhattan Beach. Skinner went down there, and he started picking people. And as he started picking his people, he also picked other people, whites as well, and so forth. And this guy was building his own Coast Guard, and nobody knew it. It was too late when you go back to that first picture when they were all standing up. It was too late then, because when he had them all in formation, somebody walked by and like, whoa, what's going on here? Of a crew of about 120, 130, half of them are black, and they all kind of next to each other. What's going on here? Skinner knew what he was doing. And guess one of the guys he was looking for? That young steward that was on the Northland, Oliver Henry, plucked him out wherever he was probably still on the Northland at the time, had him promoted to motor machinist mate second class, and brought him on to the Sea Cloud. And Skinner was doing this all over the place. And I'll tell you about some of the other people he kind of just integrated and brought him on. But this is why I say he's a hero in my book. Because first of all, he defied all kinds of, and remember, we're talking in the 1940s here. This guy was, like I said, he was running his own Coast Guard. He was running his own country, for all that matter. Because here's the case of first of all, you had him, and Skinner was somewhat of a socialite, came from a family well-to-do and so forth, and he did very well and so forth. But he found himself seeing that justice needs to be taken care of properly by putting the right people in the right jobs. And that's what he did. Now, as he was doing that, all of a sudden, and it comes out, well, now Lieutenant Commander Skinner, because he got promoted to get the ship, do you know what that guy is doing up there in Boston? And like I said, it was too late, because by then, Sea Cloud had already gone out on a couple of patrols and things went well. The whites that were serving with the blacks on the ship were having a good time. They, all of a sudden, everything you wanted to expect to happen, happened. Or for those who looked at it from a pessimistic standpoint, all of those who wanted to see happen didn't happen. Carlton Skinner. And this is why I say he is my hero and will forever be my hero. And I remember when I was sitting down talking to him, and and I had my little notes, and I was going through pretty much all of the things that I saw that was written on him and so forth, and he laughed at the point where when he saw the part about this was a test. And he laughed. That's when he told me the story. He said, it was no test. He said, the only test really was there was me getting court-martialed. He said, well, and I said, well, did you have any issues after you did that? He said, oh, yeah, some people come up and they said a few things and all that, but then all of a sudden, they left me alone. And so he just continued on, and he did the things what he did. The key part here is, he's looking at the last part of this slide, that no special favors and no publicity. Well, truth of the matter is, the no publicity had more to do with Skinner not getting caught and getting court-martialed. But the other part to this is that in order for the men to do their jobs effectively, is that look, I don't want any barriers in here. I don't want anything, And when they start finding out that he had been doing this kind of stuff, various organizations, particularly like the NAACP and so forth, they really wanted to talk about it. And Skinner said, no. I want these guys to do their job, do it effectively, and we'll show them by our results and by our success. So, Carlton Skinner, truly, a man larger than life, a man that knew how to schmooze with the right people, as you can see in this picture here with Marjorie Post and Mr. Davies, and along with they were primarily yacht club. You see them in uniform. They're primarily yacht club members and so forth. They are. That when the ship was turned over. Okay, here's the other funny story here. When the ship was turned over, when Mrs. Post and Mr. Davies came on board, and as the crew going around about and so forth. Because first of all, the Sea Cloud was manned by an all-white crew before Skinner got on there. So Skinner wanted to keep that crew on board for a while until he took ownership of the Sea Cloud. Camouflage. So as you see, the certificate of appreciation that was handed to Marjorie Post and so forth, those people standing there, and if they looked off into the view, I wish I saw a picture of that. They didn't see a black face there. So right after this ceremony, probably give it a week or two, Skinner brought his people on. And thus began the greatness of Carlton Skinner. So, as I said, he was larger than life. He was a guy that, like I said, came from a socialite type background. So he knew how to talk to these people. He knew how to talk to people with money. He knew how to get things necessary and so forth and get through. And he was so smart about it that he figured that if he got caught, he had some people that were going to back him up. Because what happened, and when this all started happening, Marjorie Post particularly, when she found out about this integrated crew, she backed Skinner to the hilt. And it became the point of that, don't mess with my ship, is what she kind of said. And it kind of flowed on from there. So, what did they do? How did they do? Well, like I said, they performed phenomenal. Now, the Sea Cloud didn't engage in combat per se, but they did certain things like, they passed 2 Atlantic Fleet inspections with no deficiencies. And let me tell you, can you imagine what kind of inspections that they had when the crew, when these inspectors came on? I remember when I had talked with Carlton Skinner, and I also talked with Robert Hammond, another crew member that was on there. They talked about, these guys are making stuff up when they came on to try to do things. But Skinner was the smartest guy of them all, because when the crew started working on the ship overall, they made it work. And for the most part, the crew, and I'm talking about black and white, they knew that the success of this ship was going to be if the crew stayed intact and did and worked together, which they did. And it was probably one of the most spick and span type vessel in the naval history of sorts. And it's all because of what they had to do. And then the other things that were officially credited with helping sink a German submarine. And they did that by virtue of, while they were out on patrol, they were able to take the fixes, find out where that German sub was, and then another ship came out and laid depth charges to take care of that. The weather observation was even more important because, and I remember we're thinking in the 40s, there was no weather satellite going around up there and so forth. You go out there with the big giant balloon, let it off, and keep track of it and so forth. So they had to do that, and they had to report weather all over for the convoys so everybody knew what was going on and so forth. And remember, uh, they had to do it pretty much without any kind of protection. So it was pretty much kind of a suicide run of sorts when we went out to do that. So it was heroic. It truly was. The crew members, as I said, they worked very, very close together, all of them, regardless of the color of the skin. They loved their captain. They loved what he did. They loved and he was hard. You know, in fact, the crew members I talked with, in fact, the one, you can't see him very well, but he's right behind the compass there. You're going to see a picture of him later. That's Robert Hammond. He told me that, you know, this wasn't the easiest ship to be on. One, you had to be concerned about the fact that people wanted you to fail. But even more importantly, you had a captain that nothing less than 100%. And it was explained why. And everybody did it, and did it with pride. There were no fights. When the crew would go on liberty, they all went out together. In fact, there were situations where they would go to locations because it was segregated. The white crew members would either figure out a way and get their black crew members in, or they just go off and go somewhere else. But they all worked very, very close together. The first two, yeah, no, it looks cold. I just see people shudder right there. The first two black officers in the Coast Guard, actually there were 3 black officers in the Coast Guard, but the first 2 that graduated from the Coast Guard Officer Candidate School, and I'll tell you more about those 2. They went to the Sea Cloud. You know how they ended up on Sea Cloud? Skinner. Skinner made that happen, because even as this was going on, him picking his own crew, at first headquarters thought, well, it couldn't be that bad because he's not gonna get any black officers, because Coast Guard didn't have any black officers. Well, it turned out a few of them were able to go through Officer Candidate School, and guess who was standing at the gate, ready to suck them up? There's Joseph Jenkins, who actually is a little history of mine from my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. He was the first commissioned officer, African American, in the Coast Guard. He received his commission 1 year before the Navy commissioned their first African American. And why is he notable for me? Like I say, he's from Detroit. And any of you been to Detroit? Okay. You ever driven down John C. Lodge Freeway? Anybody know what that is? US 10? Okay. That's, you know, that guy, the guy that developed that was Joseph Jenkins. Okay, he developed that. So he was, you know, like I said, quite a guy in terms of somebody who had so much smarts, so much intelligence and involvement. Skinner knew who he was picking. And then there's Clarence Samuels, another unique individual of sorts, who he also has a very wonderful and somewhat storied past a little bit about him. But he started out in the Coast Guard as a steward. And as you see, he became the first African American to reach the rank of Chief Warrant Officer. And for those of you to understand that, so in the 3 levels of ranks in the Coast Guard, and as well as the Navy and other military, you have officers, the commissioned officers, and then you have what is called Chief Warrant Officer or Warrant Officer, and then you have enlisted. The Warrant Officer Corps, they're a combination of a specialty type enlisted people, but they move up into a middle rank of becoming officers. And Clarence Samuels had that pleasure of reaching that level of becoming a chief warrant officer. And he did a couple other things. He was like the first black photographer, maybe the first black chief quartermaster. He just sort of did it all. And then he was later promoted to lieutenant junior grade on the Sea Cloud. He was the navigation officer. If you have gone over to see the display, there's a jacket that says navigator. There's the guy. Okay? That's his jacket. So he's done an awful lot. And then after his time on the Sea Clouds, you can see on there, Clarence Samuels went on to do other amazing things, as well as commanding two other Coast Guard vessels, which, by the way, they were integrated. Again, before integration became legal, but he was able to do that over the course of his 27-year career. Okay, all right, you know Jacob Lawrence, right? At least the people in here, you know, and there's been some talk about there's going to be a presentation next week. We talk about Jacob Lawrence. I had the wonderful pleasure of meeting Jacob Lawrence, a wonderful pleasure of meeting a wonderful man. And here's his story. How did he end up on the Sea Cloud? Well, Jacob came into the Coast Guard. He was in Manhattan Beach, where the blacks went for boot camp. And then along came a lieutenant, tapped him on the shoulder within about a week before he graduated, and said, "Lawrence, I know you." And Lawrence looked up at him. He didn't know him. He says, "My name is Lieutenant Carlton Skinner, and I'm going to command the ship, and I want you to be on the ship." And you know, and from Jacob Lawrence's standpoint, hey, I could be a steward on anything. So if this guy wants me, I'm in. Lawrence shows up, ready to become the steward, goes into the cabin to say hello to the captain, and Skinner says, no, you're not going to be a steward. Remember, Skinner was running his own Coast Guard. and so Lawrence, I'm not going to be a steward? He says, no, not with the skill set that you have. He says, you know what you're going to be? You're going to be a combat artist. The Coast Guard didn't have a position called combat artist. But that's what he did. In fact, when Lawrence, you know, accepted the assignment, because they didn't have because he in the enlisted specialties, you have a specialty with your rank and so forth. So they were trying to figure out what to wear since this didn't exist. One day he said he was wearing the rank of a storekeeper, you know, but storekeepers cross keys, and that's supply. One day he was wearing cross quills, which is yeoman for personnel. Lawrence said he had like 5 or 6 different ranks that he wore because there was nothing else out there. But what he had to do was draw, and that's all Skinner wanted him to do. And he drew, and he drew, and he drew, and you saw some examples. If you visited the room there and so forth to see everything, but you know, and unfortunately there is a lot more drawings that he had done that no one can find and so forth. But Jacob Lawrence was, of course, a very phenomenal man, and he was part of the Sea Cloud crew. This is a very interesting drawing. The engine room. Carlton Skinner had asked Lawrence if he could draw a little bit more of what's going on the ship. And Lawrence says, okay. So he went down in the engine room and he said, what are you guys doing down there? What exactly? You know, and the guy kind of explained it to him, and so Jacob Lawrence decided to draw what he thinks the engine room looks like. Yeah, this is very interesting, the embarkation of the Sea Cloud. Now, there's 100 ways you can look at that. You know, Jacob Lawrence was known as the Black Picasso. I think you probably heard that term. Where, you know, like if you follow, you know, drawings of Picasso and so forth, it's sometimes a little bit abstract and so forth. You know, that's kind of what Lawrence was. So when he looked at this embarkation part, it could be looked at a number of ways. That the troops coming onto the ship, people going off the ship, a little bit of confusion going on and so forth. It's a little bit of everything. But to Jacob Lawrence, this is one of his better pieces that he did while he was on Sea Cloud. And then he did the decommissioning, which I don't know if anybody can. I think beyond just having those copied prints and so forth, the original, I believe, has not been found. Okay, this guy Oliver Henry. Remember I told you the story on the Northland the young steward that figured it out, and then he went to the Sea Cloud as a motor machinist, made second class. Well, this guy's life took off way after that. He went on, he became a chief warrant officer, machinist, and continued to do phenomenal work. And in that phenomenal work that he continued to do, and when he retired and he passed away, the Coast Guard named a Coast Guard cutter after him, the Coast Guard cutter Oliver Henry, which is home ported in Guam. Other man that I told you that I knew about, Robert Hammond. You remember when I showed you the picture of the guy standing behind the compass and so forth? Well, Bob Hammond became the first African American to reach the rank of Master Chief Bosun Mate. And he was a very close friend of my #1 Sea Daddy, Sonny Wise at the time, and I heard just so much about what he had done. And I had the pleasure of meeting him as well. The awards that the Sea Cloud, pretty much all of the ships and units during World War II were pretty much presented those particular unit awards, but there's a catch for that. Each of those come with a percentage of how well they do on their inspections and so forth. And the American Campaign Medal, you see a star on there, that represents superlative performance. The USS Mason, and I know I got to run this up real quick here. The USS Mason, which was run by the Navy, the Navy wanted to get in the action now. Okay? And guess who they went to ask how to do this? Skinner. And Skinner sort of engineered this to make it happen. He did not serve on it. He stayed Coast Guard. But the USS Mason, which was also based out of Boston, became an integrated unit. It's actually tied up next to the Sea Cloud. But Skinner wasn't done, because when the Sea Cloud was turned back over to Marjorie Post and to Mr. Davies, he went on to another ship. And he did the same thing. By then, the Coast Guard just left the guy alone. This is not the guy to mess around with. So the Hokum became the third integrated military ship. And remember, this was all done before the integration of the armed forces, which was July 26, 1948. So think about that. Skinner was breaking the law and loving every second of it. So what happened to him afterwards? If you, anyone here ever been to Guam? A couple. Yeah, just about everything in Guam is named after him, and rightfully so, because he became the first governor of Guam. And remember, this was right after World War II. Guam in itself was already in disrepair of sorts, and he brought everything back together in Guam. Of course, he went on later to do many, many other things, and he died in 2004 at the ripe old age of 91. And when I met him, it was in 1999, so it was just a few years before that. But this is my hero, Carlton Skinner. So I'm kind of sort of out of time, I think almost. Do I have time for a question? I'm gonna be like Skinner, you know, you get a script and you just said, I know we're running out of time and so forth, but it says here that Thomas Wu, the curator of the Sea Cloud exhibition, is here in the front row and also available to answer questions about the exhibit, which is wonderful. If you haven't seen the exhibit, please go see that. So I got my microphone person here, and I know Katie's back there getting ready to run me out of here, but I'll take a couple questions. Okay?
Hi. Since I think I heard you say you did also meet Jacob Lawrence,
I did.
That right?
Yep, and I have a print of his.
Yeah. Do you care to share what that was like?
Oh my gosh, that's another thing to say. Other than the fact, I knew who he was. I knew everything about him. So when I met him, much later in my Coast Guard career life. I was Master Chief of the Coast Guard at the time, and I went out to Seattle. And in fact, it was a birthday present. I was going out to go visit units, and and the district there, they knew my birthday was coming up, so they says, well, we got somebody we want to take you over to go meet. And I went over to meet Jacob Lawrence, and we had a very, very wonderful discussion. He was, he was more giddy and more proud of me than I was of him by virtue of the fact that here he is looking at me, Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, first black to reach this particular rank. And then you think back to, back in the 40s where he was and so forth, and to see this. So, we had this admiration thing going on for the first hour of our discussion, but we talked for, oh my gosh, for a good 3+ hours. And we not only talked about the Coast Guard and Carlton Skinner and so forth, but I was very much interested in just what makes that man think. I mean, you've seen a lot of the things that he do, and like I said, in that term, the Black Picasso, he was wonderful. I mean, he knew how to draw before he had to be taught how to draw. He said the only thing he learned when he went to art school was the use of colors. Beyond that, he had everything else going on. So, but he was just a wonderful guy.
Skinner been recognized or honored by also having a ship named after him, or has the Coast Guard done any other way of honoring his legacy?
The answer to that question is no. And I went out the risk of just getting a little bit heated over this, because I will tell you firsthand that a Coast Guard vessel should have been named after him a long time ago. But there are things that are named after him at the Coast Guard sector in Guam. The base command center is named in his honor. There is also a couple of other locations throughout the Coast Guard of buildings named after him. That ain't enough. I mean, that really isn't enough. And I know we had a scheme that was defined on vessel naming and so forth. And when the vessel that was named after Oliver Henry said that class of vessel could only be named after people who were enlisted. So he didn't fall in that particular category. But there were categories that he did fall into, and his name was not brought up. And I think a lot of it has to do with what we're talking about here today, and that is the fact that very few people know about this guy. Very few people know about this guy. And like I said, this guy broke the law. I'm serious. I mean, this guy broke the law. And he did it. He did it for the rights of people. We are dealing with this whole issue with, today about, DEI and all these other kinds of things. Well, this guy lived it, and lived with every ounce of what it was all about and what it was supposed to be. So, yeah, I'm sorry. You kind of triggered me in this thing that until my dying day, I am going to get something named after that man. So, thank you. All right. So Katie told whoever had the microphone to sit down. So, oh, there you are. You're over there. Okay, we got. Oh, okay. Well, you went over there. Okay. All right. I've got one more over here.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Oh, okay. Good. Okay. All right. Okay. You can put the shotgun down, Katie. Go ahead. Who do I call on?
Who's the next person? Someone have a hand up?
Did I have some? Oh, there we go. Right up there. Here we go.
I've got it.
Wait, yeah, you got to talk in there so people on the.
Oh, I'm curious about Jacob Lawrence and what led Skinner to think about putting an artist on his ship. I wouldn't imagine that was the norm for other ships.
No, well, if you remember, I said he was a bit of a socialite, right? So that might have been item number one. But here's the thing: is I was sort of profiling some of the amazing crew members on that ship. Skinner, it was true to prove his point that the people he was picking were exceptional people. And Jacob Lawrence, in his viewpoint, was not going to be a steward. And so he looked at this whole thing, and particularly when he had sort of the no publicity rule about, and if you notice the things that were drawn more of telling the entire story of the U.S. in the war and so forth. And see, and this is where that other wonderful part about Skinner, that he thought about the bigger piece to this, the Coast Guard's involvement of what we had to do, our focused engagement and things like that. And so I think what happened was when he found out, and how he found out, he had his own intel system going on, particularly since there wasn't no internet back in those days, so he had to find out something from somebody. But when he found out that Jacob Lawrence was in Manhattan Beach, he was going to get him. and one thing that he wasn't going to get him to do was be a steward. So that in itself kind of, I think, just sort of adds on to just the importance as well as the type of person that Skinner was. Very much a visionary, absolutely.
Let's give a huge round of applause for Vince.
Thank you. Sorry to go over. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. And again, please enjoy the, if you haven't seen the presentations and so forth, please do that. But join me in my letter writing campaign of Carlton Skinner, U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Carlton Skinner. I'm serious about that. But tell that story. Thank you.
And please join us in the lobby for a book signing.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I would just very much appreciate it. Particularly in this day and time.